emails indicate that Exxon actually knew about climate change back in 1981. That's 7 years prior to the issue of climate change coming to the public forum. And the emails are actually written by a scientist who worked for Exxon for a very long period of time, Larry Bernstein. The Guardian actually unraveled this story, and it's amazing to see just how much they knew and just how hard they fought to keep this information either away from the public or to make sure that they debunk it by funding scientists that would say that climate change isn't a real threat. Let me give you some examples. Now, according to Larry Bernstein, Exxon first got interested in climate change in 1981 because it was seeking to develop the Natuna gas field off Indonesia. This is an immense reserve of natural gas, but it is 70% CO2, or carbon dioxide, the main driver of climate change. So at that point, they realized, hey, there's a lot of money to be made, but what kind of environmental impact could this have? And if it has a negative environmental impact, what can we do to pretend as though that impact doesn't really exist?
So it's hard not to compare it to the smoking analogy, right? Where the tobacco companies knew that tobacco was dangerous to your health. It did cause cancer. And not only did they hide it, but they spent a ton of money marketing a lie. And so in this case, Exxon knew all along. They knew it before we did, right? And you could say, hey, you know what? Maybe back in 1981, that's the first time they see the evidence. Do they think it's definitive? Okay, you want to cut them a break on that? I get it, right? But then they see the evidence and they go, oh, I got a great idea. Let's spend $30 million trying to prove that this isn't true when our own scientists indicate that it is.
That's exactly what The Guardian said. Over the years, Exxon spent more than $30 million on think tanks and researchers that promoted climate denial.
And understand that that's a hugely low estimate because they're only counting think tanks and researchers whose job it is to put out counter facts, like not facts, but counter information, propaganda, things that they know that their internal research shows aren't true, right? So then there is no excuse. But on top of that, there's hundreds of millions of dollars they spent on lobbying, donations to politicians, dark money to super PACs. So it's not just the 30 million. There's a mountain of money behind that to make sure that our politicians sold us out and acted on behalf of ExxonMobil.
Now, I should note that they never decided to use that gas field, Natuna. They didn't develop on it. I don't know why. They didn't give reasons for why they decided against it. But they were asked about the statements made by the scientists that used to work for them. And here's what they had to say. Asked about Bernstein's comments, Exxon said climate science in the early 1980s was at a preliminary stage. But the company now saw climate change as a risk. So they've since changed their mind about climate change. But understand that there was already a consensus among scientists regarding climate change in the 1970s. So they're lying about that as well. The science in 1981 on this subject, this is again Exxon trying to defend themselves, was in the very, very early days, and there was considerable division of opinion. There was nobody you could have gone to in 1981 or 1984 who would have said whether it was real or not. Nobody could provide a definitive answer. However, a Harvard University professor actually completely disagrees with that. She researches the history of climate science, and she said it was unsurprising that Exxon would have factored climate change in its plans in the early 1980s, but she disputed Bernstein's suggestion that other companies were not. She also took issue with Exxon's assertion that uncertainty about the science in the 1980s, noting the National Academy of Science describing a consensus on climate change from the 1970s.
So the scientists already have a consensus in the 70s. Exxon gets their own internal report in 1981. And by the way, Exxon and Mobil later merged. That's why they're now ExxonMobil. In 1988, Dr. Hansen comes out publicly and starts to warn about climate change. So then it gets into the public consciousness in 1988, but the science was actually already settled much earlier than that.
Yes.
And now we find out it was even settled within Exxon. And then they decided, let's do the propaganda and try to trick people into thinking the opposite. Why? Because they had trillions of dollars to make. So along those lines, let's also remember that is another instance of privatize the gains, I make all the money from the oil, socialize the losses. Because the losses are going to affect everybody. Climate change doesn't just affect the Exxon executives, it affects the whole planet. So if you've got severe weather in Africa and it turns out you can't feed your family and then you have mass migrations and you've got all these different problems, or you got floods and droughts in California, Texas, et cetera, well, that's your problem. Yeah. ExxonMobil's not paying the cost of that. It's costing the rest of us billions of dollars, for the whole globe trillions of dollars. But they socialize those losses.
Yeah.
So that's when they believe in socialism.